Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen, wassalatu wassalam ala rasulina Muhammad al-Amin, wa na'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Welcome back to this discussion that we've been having with regard to Javed Ahmed Ghamidi's counter-narrative on religion and the state in Islam. This discussion, as we've been going through the last many sessions, has looked at the traditional narrative of this relationship between religion and state, and then Ghamdi's critique of that narrative. This critique articulated in an article back in 2015 or so, and then a series of lectures that year that expounded on many aspects of that critique. In particular, there are 10 points that he goes over. 10 points where he expresses a counter-narrative to how we have traditionally understood these ideas, these concepts within Islam that have an impact on the relationship between the state and religion, the state and its constituents or its citizens. Up to this point, we've gotten through 5 of them. The last point that we discussed was this idea that while certain offenses, religious offenses, within Islam are punishable, right? And what are those religious offenses? It is shirk, the association of partners with God. It's kufr, it's the rejection of truth that you know to be truth. It is apostasy, it is leaving the Islamic faith. That those are religious offenses, grave offenses, and punishable offenses, but in Ghamdi's view, not punishable by a human being. That they are punishable by God, and that God will punish them in the afterlife or during the era of prophets and messengers, which has now ended, God would punish through his messengers. Right? So that was the 5th point that we had discussed, and that Ghamdi puts forward to say, hey, we have traditionally understood the fuqaha, the fiqh, the juristic literature in Islam has actually given authority to human agents in the state to be able to punish these offenses. But that this, in Ghamdi's view, has been a very serious and consequential mistake that has created a ton of disorder and a ton of problems within Muslim society. That in fact, for Muslim society, Muslim politics, Muslim culture, rectifying this mistake is absolutely essential because it has been the cause of sectarian strife, or at least exacerbated sectarian strife. It's exacerbated many societal issues as human beings have even exceeded sort of the bounds by saying, well, even the fuqaha would only give this authority to the state, but in fact, people have taken that authority into their own hands, and we have seen the consequences of people taking into their own hands the punishment of these religious offenses. Okay, so that was the 5th point. In this session, we're going to spend the next 20, 25 minutes or so discussing the 6th and the 7th point. And the 6th and the 7th point that Ghamdi Saab raises are related to the idea of jihad. Both of the points, the idea of jihad. So he says, with regard to this, he says, look, there is absolutely no doubt that jihad itself, right, fighting in the way of God, armed struggle in the way of God, right? He's speaking about jihad here, not in kind of the metaphorical sense or in the sense of jihad an-nafs that sometimes will be present within our Islamic literature. He's speaking of jihad as armed struggle here. He says that there's no doubt, he says, that jihad is a directive within Islam, that exists. There's no doubt. The Quran requires, he says, its followers, if they have the capability, requires Muslims that if they have the capability, they must have the capability, right, to fight against oppression and tyranny, right, to fight against zulm, right, to fight against oppression and tyranny. And Ghamdi's elaborated on this, on the law of jihad within his books, especially Meezan, his kind of magnum opus. So there's much more detail there. But what he goes through here is he talks about the idea that in his view, the Quran does not give the directive for jihad against kufr, shirk, or apostasy. that jihad is not carried out on religious grounds, right? Or as some kind of holy war of sorts, right? It is not a directive, he says, based on religion per se, right? The directive related to killing on religious grounds is a separate discussion, and that's what we had previously gone over, but it's not related to jihad, right? With regard to the directive of jihad, it's also not for the expansion of territory, for the building of empire, for the acquisition of wealth, for the acquisition of territory. None of that is a legitimate objective with regard to the directive of jihad as kind of put forward within the Islamic sources. What it is that there's simply a directive to fight against oppression and tyranny, right? You have a directive to help the oppressed, just like in the case of penal laws or criminal laws, which we had previously discussed, right? You have a directive, we talked about this in the last session. The state has a directive to punish violators, right, of other people's rights. To punish people who have oppressed other people, right, in that societal context, by either violating their rights or violating their life, their honor, their wealth. At the state level then, where there are other states that are engaged in oppression and tyranny, the state then has the directive of jihad to come forth to help the oppressed. There's a consistent principle here. When you have state power in the world, you can punish criminals for their crimes and stand with the victim. And in the context of jihad, if a nation oppresses, then you can stand with the victims there, with the oppressed there, right? This exercise of violence and armed struggle and fighting, this exercise of violence in the context of jihad, in the context of criminal law, occurs to side with and to help the victims. The victims of either oppression at the hands of a state or oppression at the hands of other individuals. So fighting to help the oppressed is permitted, and in fact, in some cases, required. In the Quran, the primary reason for this directive of jihad is to curtail persecution. The Quran has not used, according to Ghamidi says, the Quran has not used the words oppression and tyranny. What it has done is it has discussed the idea of curtailing fitna, chaos. That is the objective of any fighting. And so the question arises, that Ghamidi Sahib raises, is what is fitna? And in the Quran he says, what fitna means is it means oppressing and forcing a person to give up their religion. It is essentially the directive in the Quran with regard to jihad is against religious persecution. If someone is subjected to cruelty and persecution based on religion, then fighting is a way to rescue them from that state of affairs. Other texts, he says then, in the Quran, make clear through analogy, right, through sort of connection to this principle, that it is permissible to fight against any other type of oppression as well, not just religious persecution. According to Ghamidi, the original directive, original rule is to end religious persecution, but by extension, that rule applies to all other types of oppression and tyranny. So that's point number one, that jihad, the directive of jihad, is against religious persecution and by extension against any other type of oppression and tyranny. In addition, he says we have to be clear, Muslims have not been given this directive in their individual capacity. Rather, it is in their collective capacity. right? This is not like their daily prayers or fasting in Ramadan, right? Where those are individual directives to the individual. This is given to the Muslim collective. Religious persecution is a type of rebellion against God. And the Quran has made this clear all throughout its text, that God's scheme is given to humans freedom to make their own choices, that he could have very easily, it says in the Quran, that he could have very easily allowed everyone to become a believer. But instead, messengers who were sort of concerned with the fact that people were not necessarily believing, etc., God says, no, I could have made everyone a believer, but I didn't. I gave people free will. I gave them freedom to make choices. So you don't need to worry about outcomes. You need to worry about that process of conveying the message, because I've given freedom. That there is no coercion in religion. Quran says the truth will stand out from error. There's no coercion there. Hence, because there's no coercion, because people have freedom, because this is a right that God has given, religious persecution, forcing people to accept or reject religion, is essentially declaring war against God. It means taking away a fundamental right that God has given to people. And as Ghamidi notes, that directive for jihad is to help rescue people who have been put in that position, who are persecuted in that way. And by extension, by analogy, other types of oppression and tyranny as well, to help them. And he says, while there's much talk about jihad in the world, the truth is that sadly, people want to talk about jihad against persecution. But when that persecution actually exists, particularly religious persecution, there's rarely any talk. When people are prevented from going to masjids, prevented from exercising their freedom to pray, to worship, etc., that no one speaks about this as a context where the jihad directive now applies. No one wants to fight in those actual cases that exist. And here we can see, and I'm adding this myself, in the modern context, situations in different parts of the world, whether we're looking at Myanmar and the Rohingya, or whether we're looking at the Uyghurs in China, or even other places, arguably even places where it's not the Islamic faith that's being persecuted, but other faiths, that freedom, that persecution of people's ability to worship, to believe, to make that choice, that doesn't come up as a place where jihad then is spoken about. And for Ghamidi, this suggests jihad has become a tool for political manipulation as opposed to a religious directive. Even the notion, Ghamidi says, that jihad is carried out only in defensive circumstances, that this is oftentimes, one might argue that in the Muslim apologetics literature, that this is oftentimes how jihad might be characterized. That, jihad is only in defense. Ghamidi rejects this idea. He says, jihad is against oppression and tyranny. Aggression can be a type of oppression, right? So certainly in those defensive contexts, jihad could be engaged, but you can defend against it there, right? But if you don't need to wait to be attacked in order to engage in jihad with regard to an oppression that's occurring by a nation against others, right? Like, it doesn't have to be defensive. It can be offensive. You're addressing a situation of oppression and tyranny that exists. There's some country, he says, in the world that's slaughtering people, or people are being prevented from praying or practicing their faith. You don't need to wait for them to come and attack you in order to raise the banner of jihad. The banner of jihad is raised to address oppression, to address tyranny, or can be raised, right, if people have capability. And it is for the collective or for the system that's organizing society to make these decisions, whether it's the state or in the past tribal orders, to make the decision whether they have the capability to do this, the capacity to do this, etc. It is not for the individual. It is not for a group of Muslims to make that decision of whether jihad should be engaged in and make that decision on behalf of everyone else. That, Ghamidi Sahib says, is a type of anarchy. It is only the right of the governing polity to make that decision with regard to jihad. As the hadith from Bukhari says, a Muslim ruler is the shield of the people. War can only be carried out under him, and people should seek his shelter. The governing system, whoever the leader is, the process for governance, right? All those things will go into making the decision with regard to jihad, not an individual making that decision. So that's the sixth point. With regard to jihad, its parameters, the fact that jihad is for ending oppression, ending tyranny, that it is a directive to the collective, not to the individual. That's the sixth point. The seventh point also relates to jihad, and here it talks about the ethical requirements of jihad. What Ghamidi Sahib says is that the directive of jihad, right, is for war for God's cause, right? The directive of jihad in Islam is for war for God's cause, but this cannot be waged while disregarding the ethical requirements or moral considerations that come up during warfare. You cannot surpass ethical limits within the engagement of jihad. And in fact, even in situations, the Quran talks about situations, Ghamidi Sahib says, that where Muslims are being persecuted, but you have a treaty with the nation that's doing the persecution. You cannot take action there. You would first have to withdraw from that treaty or let the treaty's terms end before you engage. Even those people that God determined would be punished on earth, that Itimam al-Hujjah had been completed, that the proof had been completed on them, that truth was manifest, that they were now rejectors of truth while accepting that it was true. Even some of those people had treaties with the Prophet, peace be upon him, and the Prophet was told to hold off until those treaties had come to completion before engaging in war with them. Ethical and moral principles are always paramount. As a result, what Ghamidi Sahib says is, it is bearing this in mind, the most important thing is that it is absolutely clear that jihad can only be against combatants. Only against those who raise or take up arms against you. The primary ethical principle that it arguably exists everywhere is to not violate the sanctity of life. This is a supreme human right, as Ghamidi Sahib says, above all else, of tremendous value. In fact, the Quran has said that if you unjustly kill somebody, it is as though you have killed all of humanity. That it's at that level. Only when someone picks up a weapon against you do they become a legitimate target for your violence against them. If someone attacks you with the tongue, then you can only respond with the tongue. So here he raises the issue of the Taliban. Part of the justification that they gave for why they shot Malala, they said she had raised the propaganda against them with her tongue. But Ghamidi Sahib says, in that situation, you do not have the right to raise weapons against her. You have the right to raise a propaganda against her, to speak with your tongue against her. All right? Even in a scenario where someone is on the battlefield fighting you and they drop their weapon, they say, okay, we're done. We're no longer fighting. They put their weapons down. That person becomes a non-combatant, even on the battlefield. You cannot kill them. You can take them prisoner, but you cannot kill them. Those are the ethical limits with regard to jihad. They are a non-combatant in that moment. It'd be unjust to kill those who are not actively fighting against you. The Prophet has forbidden the killing of women and children. Oftentimes, women and children in pre-modern times, in ancient times, in medieval times, that they would accompany fighters to the battlefield. They were non-combatants. Many times those women would be on the field, encouraging and pushing the fighters to fight harder, they were, in that sense, helping the war effort. They were still non-combatant, according to Islam. Jihad could not be waged against them. They could not be killed, they could not be fought, right? Even if they were playing a supporting role. So what are the key points here? What are the key points here in these discussions that we've had? The sixth and seventh point, relating to jihad, the key points are this. Jihad is against oppression and tyranny, number one. The jihad directive is not given to Muslims in their individual capacity, but in their collective one. So their governing authorities are going to make the decisions in this regard. All ethical limits must be obeyed in the context of jihad. You cannot kill innocent people. You can only take up arms. You can only engage in jihad against combatants, as long as they remain combatants. They leave their weapons, they drop their weapons, they choose to surrender, they are no longer combatants, even if they're on the battlefield. You cannot make this argument, Ghamidi Sahib says, that, people are giving their taxes or their wealth to support the war. Or on the battlefield, they're pushing the war propaganda or using their words to encourage fighters. No, they are still non-combatants. Islam does not give the right to kill them, nor do moral standards, he says, nor does international law, frankly. But Islam itself does not. And the reason that he raises these points is because, in his view, there have been serious transgressions in this regard. Serious transgressions with regard to both how jihad is understood as to what its objectives, where it can be engaged in, and how it's carried out, and in terms of the ethical limits that have been transgressed in this regard. So those are the sixth and seventh points. Inshallah, in future lectures, we'll get to the eighth, ninth, and 10th points. Wa akhir ad-da'wa walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.